The last few weeks have been focusing primarily on the early 1800s and some of the economic and political changes that resulted from the Industrial Revolution. Now, for the next two sessions, I'm going to be focusing on some of the social reform movements that take place during this same time period. And a lot of these are a response to some of the issues and problems that result from industrial and urban growth. For this reason, the 19th century is often referred to as the Age of Reform. If you take part 2 of U.S. history, you'll see that this Age of Reform extends throughout the remainder of the 19th century and well into the 20th century. Before we get into the reform movements of this era, I want to touch briefly on the presidency of Martin Van Buren. Van Buren is going to be elected in 1836, and this is going to be the first election where we see our newly formed Whig Party running candidates in a presidential election. So Van Buren was Andrew Jackson's vice president after John C. Calhoun resigned in 1833. So Van Buren, as vice president, he's going to run for president after Andrew Jackson leaves office. So he's, of course, representing the Democratic Party, and the Whig Party still not really organized and focused at this point. They're still struggling to come up with some kind of a coherent agenda, and they haven't quite gotten that sorted out yet. So they run 3 separate candidates, and these 3 candidates are from various backgrounds, trying to appeal to the various groups within the Whig Party. And it's, of course, unsuccessful. Van Buren is kind of riding the coattails of Andrew Jackson's popularity, and Van Buren will win very easily in this 1836 election. What happens, though, is that despite his residual popularity of Andrew Jackson, at least among the voters, Van Buren gets off to a very rocky start, because in his first year in office is when this panic of 1837 that we already talked about that in the last session. This panic of 1837 hits as soon as Martin Van Buren takes office, and this economic recession is going to last well into the 1840s. So pretty much all of Martin Van Buren's presidency is going to be mired in this economic depression that's just, nothing is really going right in the economy. People are struggling. A lot of people are out of work. People have lost a lot of their homes and farms. So the American people are having a pretty hard time of it during this time period, and it's just a tendency among Americans, and of course this is just human nature. We tend to blame whoever's in charge at the time for whatever's going wrong. And while if you remember from the last session, the factors that contributed to this panic of 1837, most of this was part of Andrew Jackson's economic policy, and that really kind of left this problem for Van Buren to deal with. So he didn't create this problem, but he ends up having to deal with it, and everyone blames him for it because Andrew Jackson is gone. Van Buren is the guy in the hot seat. So he's the one that gets a lot of the blame for this. In fact, there was a common expression at the time. A lot of people referred to him as Martin Van Ruin because he had ruined the economy, which of course was not true, but he gets the blame. Now, what we can blame Van Buren for is, even though he didn't cause this recession, he doesn't do anything to help it or to bring any kind of relief or to try and address the situation to try and improve it. Van Buren, like his predecessor Andrew Jackson, believes in a hands-off approach with regard to the government's involvement in the economy. The federal government does nothing here. Van Buren says, he comes right out and says that it's not the government's responsibility to interfere in the nation's economic cycle. The economy does what it does, and it doesn't need any help from the government. So the government's not going to do anything here to try and provide relief to businesses or to citizens or anything. Just kind of hands-off approach for the economy. And to make matters worse, even though a lot of people don't really have any specific criticism of the federal government not getting involved, again, this is a popular idea at the time. But Van Buren expresses no sympathy at all for the people and these people who've lost everything, the people who are struggling economically. So he comes across as kind of calloused and unsympathetic, and as if he doesn't really care about the American people. And this just kind of aggravates the situation. And one of the reasons why he will only serve one term, serving as president during an economic recession like this, especially when you have a refusal to really get involved or let the government get involved with it, this almost always leads to a loss of popularity. Just to kind of illustrate what we're talking about here, this economic recession, this illustration appeared in a newspaper at the time, in the early 1840s. But what happens is, of course, the date on this flag says July 4th, 1837, and of course 1837 is when this whole thing begins. So this is referring to this year, this bad year of this economic crisis. And this illustration is of no city in particular, no place or day in particular, but it's a kind of a composite of all the things that are going wrong with the economy. You've got a lot of people out of work. There's people that are homeless on the streets. There's women and children begging. These tradesmen here, a carpenter and a mason, they're barefoot, they're out of work, they're hungry. A lot of people, of course, you see this pawn shop here. This guy has got a whole rack of shoes. People are selling everything of any value in order to make some money in order to feed themselves. And you see here too, a lot of businesses. This customs house, a tax collector, the place that collects the tariffs and taxes. All bonds must be paid in specie, gold or silver. Right next door is the bank that has a sign that said no specie payments made here. So the bank doesn't have any gold or silver. So there's a whole mob of people outside the bank trying to get their money, and there isn't any. So everything about this image, this picture, just kind of illustrates all the problems that the American people are having to endure during this economic crisis. And my favorite piece of symbolism here is this hot air balloon up here in the sky. It's labeled Safety Fund. It's on fire, it's burning, and people are falling to earth. This is kind of a metaphor of how the fact that people have lost all their savings. There's no safety net here. There's no one has anything to fall back on, and the whole system is kind of going up in flames. So this illustration really goes a long way toward showing how bad this economic situation is going to be for a lot of people. The one thing that Van Buren does do during this time period is that it actually makes things worse. Van Buren saw that without the presence of the U.S. Bank, the economy was all the federal government's money was in these private and local banks. And Van Buren is realizing that, okay, if this economy really spirals downward any further, the federal government might lose all of its money too, because if these banks, these private and state banks go under, then the federal government might lose all of its money. So Van Buren convinces Congress to pass an act creating this independent treasury system. And this is not a bank. It doesn't function like a bank. It is just a storage facility for money, essentially a vault or a series of vaults in various cities throughout the United States. Basically, this independent treasury system, now the federal government will withdraw all of its money from all the local and state banks and put it in this secure treasury vault. So basically, all of the United States government's money is now secure in this treasury system. And it's not in any kind of bank at all. There's no federal government money in any kind of bank. What happens is that this ends up prolonging the depression and slowing down the economy even further, because when you take all this money, all this gold and silver out of the banks and lock it away in a vault, a federal vault, it's no longer circulating through the economy. With the money in a bank, the banks will loan out this money to investors and for various reasons. and of course they'll receive interest on these loans, and this is how the money will grow. This money circulating through the economy. Without any of this money in the banks, it's all locked away in the Treasury vault. There's not as much cash flowing through the economy, and the nature of a market economy depends on the flow of money through the system. People buying and selling things, money changing hands on a regular basis. With a significant portion of the money now of the economy now all locked away in this federal treasury system, there's less money flowing through the economy, less business taking place, and this will end up prolonging the depression. So the federal government's money is protected now. In this economic crisis, at least the federal government will not lose any of its money, but it ends up kind of slowing the economy down even further. So this is pretty much it for Van Buren. He only serves one term. The term is completely characterized by this economic recession and his, of course, the government's lack of any effort to really relieve this economic crisis or to do anything about it. And what little they do attempt actually prolongs it. So no big surprise that Van Buren will not be reelected. Just kind of a typical pattern here in terms of the public's response to economic crises. They blame the guy in charge. The president gets all the blame here, even though he didn't really have anything to do with it. So he's unpopular, and he'll be voted out of office after only one term. When we talk about this age of reform, again, we're referring to the entire 19th century, all of the 1800s. And actually, it extends well on into the 20th century or the early 1900s. It's characterized. This whole century is characterized by numerous reform movements that emerge as a response to various social problems that are coming up, byproducts of rapid industrialization and urban growth. So a lot of problems. Social problems are these byproducts of this growth, and these reform movements are an attempt to try and address some of these social problems. And in most every case, these reform movements can be traced back to a religious revival that takes place in the early 1800s, referred to as the Second Great Awakening. Now, earlier in the semester, we talked about the first Great Awakening, or just the Great Awakening. It was a religious revival, again, an attempt by society to reconnect with its spiritual roots. The Second Great Awakening is going to function in a very similar manner, but there's going to be some important differences that will distinguish this revival from the one that we talked about before. The dates I've given you here, 1800 to 1840, these are not hard dates. This period of religious revivalism begins in roughly the early 1800s and will reach its peak sometime during this time period. And by 1840, it's kind of leveled off, and things are pretty much still. We don't see as much growth taking place after 1840 as we did in the years leading up to it. So it doesn't come to a sudden end. It just kind of tapers off, and we don't see as much afterwards. So one of the things that's going to define this Second Great Awakening is the fact that it's going to emphasize that salvation is available to everyone. And we'll talk about some specific ministers that are preaching this message here in a little bit. But evangelism is one of the key characteristics of this period. When we use the word evangelism, we're talking about basically any form of preaching or proselytizing this message of Christian values. And it's most prominent in the fundamentalist Protestant Christianity. We don't see this much in the Catholic version of Christianity. But we'll see the largest growth during this time period among Baptists and Methodists, and these are the two main evangelical Protestant Christian sects. And another thing that's going to characterize this period of revival is that we're going to see less of an emphasis on theology. The old religious formalities and hierarchies of the more traditional sects of Christianity, sometimes associated with Presbyterians and Congregationalists. These old traditions, the formal protocols and ceremonies and the hierarchy, we're going to see less emphasis on those sort of things and more emphasis on individual salvation, a person's individual relationship with their faith and with God. So this is going to be kind of the big defining characteristics of this Second Great Awakening. And the message is going to be delivered through what we'll refer to as the camp meeting, the old style tent revivals. Traveling ministers going from town to town, holding impromptu services in a field outside the edge of town. People traveling here from various places, congregating in this what looks like a county fair or a state fair with a lot of tents to house the people who've traveled great distances, tents to house the traveling ministers and his staff and so forth. So with all these tents, it looks kind of like a camp, some sort of an encampment. And so this is kind of why they call it the camp meeting. Some people who will characterize this revivalist, the Second Great Awakening, this revivalist ministry that we're looking at here. A couple guys in particular, Charles G. Finney. Finney is sometimes referred to as the father of revivalism from Western New York, and he will travel throughout the North, and he's pretty much one of the most prominent or popular revivalist ministers during this time period. And what Finney does is he didn't have any formal theological training, and here again we see this pattern of de-emphasizing the old formalities of the traditional practice of Christianity, and we see a more informal, almost casual, but very emotional, very passionate focus on individual salvation. So Finney has no formal theological training, but he's going to win a lot of converts, and he's going to kind of establish the pattern for how people think of these revival ministries. One of the things that he does that will become characteristic of all these tent revivals or these camp meetings, he will pray for sinners by name. As he's holding his service and he's conducting his prayers during the sermon, he'll mention specific people from the congregation by name. And of course, they can submit their names to him prior to the service, and he'll mention their names specifically in his prayers over the course of the sermon. And this becomes kind of a common feature in a lot of these revival sermons, is mentioning some of the congregation members by name during these prayers. He of course is going to emphasize that salvation is available to everyone, not just certain elements of society, the most faithful or the most devout practitioners. Salvation is available to everyone, whether they're in church every Sunday or whether this is the first time they've come in their whole life. So this message that anyone can receive salvation and redemption, he mentions specifically men, women, whites, blacks, Indians. He's trying to present an all-inclusive message. So salvation is available to everyone, not just a select privileged few. Some of the other things are going to characterize these camp meetings. They'll last for several days, sometimes a week or more. In this camp, during the days, there'll be majors or the main sermons, the main messages, and then of course in the afternoons and evenings there'll be smaller prayer meetings and so forth. Another feature that characterized Finney's sermons was that the front row of these tent meetings were reserved for people who were there to be saved, new converts, people who had come to this meeting specifically for the purpose of being saved or being converted there on the spot. So they sometimes refer to it as the anxious bench. The anxious bench, because these people were very anxious to convert, to be saved, and of course they they would get his full attention down in the front row. And this becomes another common feature of other revivalist ministers will kind of copy some of the patterns that Finney establishes during his ministry. Another thing that characterizes Finney's message here, this is another thing that's going to be distinctly different between the Second Great Awakening and the first, is that there's a very optimistic message here. If you remember the First Great Awakening, it was all hellfire and brimstone, you kind of finger in your face, you repent or be damned, that kind of message, that intense message intended to create a sense of urgency among congregation members. In the Second Great Awakening, we're going in a different direction. The message is very optimistic. Reassuring people that no matter what you've done in your life or what kind of path that you've been on up to this point, you can be saved. You can turn around. You can eliminate sin from your life. You get right with God and put yourself on the right path towards salvation, and that anybody can do this. This opportunity is within reach of everyone. So it's a message of hope and optimism instead of a message of fear. We see people like Finney here trying to send this message of hope and optimism that salvation is within your grasp if you follow a certain path. Another aspect of this optimistic message is that if each member of society can eliminate sin from their life individually, then society as a whole would be a better place. So each person doing their part to eliminate sin, the overall benefit to society would be that the world would be a better and happier place. So again, this is a message, very positive, very optimistic message here. And it's quite a bit different from the message that we saw in the First Great Awakening. Another individual that's going to be very prominent during this time period is a guy named Theodore Dwight Weld. Weld was actually for a while traveling with Finney, one of his disciples, and then after a while he kind of breaks out on his own and starts his own ministry. And again, these are just two names, but there's many others that are going to be doing this same sort of thing. We're just kind of focusing on these two prominent ministers. Weld was even more charismatic and passionate than Finney. He basically took Finney's model and he took it to the next level. And this is going to just basically take the whole thing up a notch. Same type of message delivered in a similar manner, but Weld is even more passionate. He's more charismatic. He draws much larger crowds. There's instances of Weld drawing crowds, congregations as many as 40,000, and we're talking stadium-sized congregations coming to see Theodore Dwight Weld deliver his sermons. And he's traveling from town to town throughout the country. And of course, he achieves a lot of popularity. And when people hear that he's coming to town, just the rumor of him coming to town will draw huge crowds. And when in his wake, of course, he leaves many converts. Many people will be saved, and they'll come. They'll be either reinvigorated in their existing faith, or they will find new faith as a result of his ministry. Another thing that's going to distinguish Theodore Dwight Weld is that his sermon has a strong anti-slavery message to it. He himself was very opposed to slavery. He believed slavery was a sin and that people have to abolish sin not only in their individual lives but in the world as well, and this sin of slavery should be eliminated. So we'll see that in addition to his message of faith and salvation, he's also preaching against the institution of slavery. So here we see kind of a connection to this Second Great Awakening and an emerging abolitionist movement that's going to start growing alongside of it. Because of people like Theodore Dwight Weld, we'll see this anti-slavery message being incorporated into the sermons and our abolitionist movement is will end up being an outgrowth of this revivalist ministry. And of course, this is kind of the tie-in here. We'll see not only the abolitionist movement, but women's rights, urban reform. A lot of these social movements that we see happening later on will be kind of an extension of, or an outgrowth of, this Second Great Awakening. Taking a look at some illustrations here. This map kind of gives us an idea of how this Second Great Awakening is going to spread. We see here, similar to the First Great Awakening, we see revival ministries taking place in the New England area, and then kind of spreading westward along the traditional migration routes toward the frontier. We see what is going to be unique about this Second Great Awakening is that in addition to revival ministries coming out of New England area, which of course is kind of a traditional epicenter of spiritual activity in the United States at this time, a second epicenter is going to emerge in Kentucky, and this is unique. Of course, during this time period, there's a lot more people living out here on the frontier in the late 1790s, early 1800s than there were during that First Great Awakening, essentially 100 years prior. So we see revival ministries beginning here on the frontier and radiating outward as well. So we got two separate movements taking place, both delivering similar messages, both unfolding in a similar way, but beginning in two separate geographic locations. And this is just an indication of how much more settled the frontier is at this point than it was during the First Great Awakening. So some of the ways that these camp meetings are taking place, out on the ground, where the ministries are actually taking place, this is kind of what they look like. We see here a revivalist minister delivering his message to an informal group of people gathered here in this camp outside of town. Again, where there's not a lot of formality here, not a lot of protocol or ceremony. We see a de-emphasis of these sort of things, and an attempt to try and focus on the individual and their own relationship with spirituality. So revivalist minister here, this is kind of a generic image of artist depicting what a camp meeting might have looked like. More specific image here, this is a Methodist camp revival during the 1820s, 1830s. And we see here, this is happening on a much larger scale. We see a grandstand here for the minister to deliver his message from. We see all these tents in the background. Some of these tents will house the minister and his entourage. Some of these tents will house some of the congregants who have traveled here from great distances to meet or hear this minister. One thing I want to draw your attention to in this image is that you see the majority of people in this congregation are women, and this is not just the perspective of the artist. This was pretty much the case. In terms of new converts, female converts outnumbered male converts more than 2 to 1. More than twice as many women are flocking to these revival meetings as there are men. And part of that is men are the ones who work outside the home or working on their farms and maybe have less time to attend these meetings. Women, made up the majority of people who had opportunities to come to these meetings. Plus, this camp meeting, these revival ministries, for many of these women, this is the first opportunity they've had to do something or to get involved with some sort of social activity outside the home. Keep in mind, during the early 1800s, from the woman's perspective, her entire world revolves around activities in the home. Taking care of the household, taking care of children, and so on and so forth. Very few opportunities for women, especially in rural areas, to really connect with anyone outside the home. So these revival ministries are a good opportunity for a lot of these women to, for the first time, to get outside the home and make some sort of social connections. So there's going to be a lot of appeal here for women who would otherwise have not had any opportunity to get involved with the community. Here another image, a similar type of imagery here. We see all the tents in the background, the grandstand fabricated here to elevate the minister so he can address these large crowds. And again, some of these crowds reach tens of thousands. A lot of these people will travel from all over the county or all over the state to visit this one location where the minister happens to be passing through. We see, of course, down here in the front row, some of the people got so excited by the passion and emotion of the ministry here that this lady seems to have passed out. At any rate, just by the physical nature of these camp meetings, they're outside, they're on the outskirts of town in a camp type setting. It's very informal, much more so than what you would see at a church or a chapel. So this is also indicative of what we see happening elsewhere in society. We talked about how society was becoming, or politics were becoming more democratic in America, with a focus on the everyday people, the common man. With people like Andrew Jackson, there's now a strong political connection between political leaders and the common man. We see a lot of this theme of an emphasis on the everyday average citizen is also being carried over into this Second Great Awakening. We see a focus here on the less formal aspects of society and a focus on the individual, regular people. Other interesting numbers here, just kind of taking a look at a graphic representation of growth during this revival period, again between 1780 and 1860. This is a little bit longer period, stretching a little bit prior to the beginning of this revival and a little bit beyond the end of it. So still covering the same general time period. We see significant growth in all major denominations of Protestant Christianity, and of course here Catholics are part of this this chart as well. But the biggest growth among Baptists and Methodists, they grew exponentially larger, especially compared to the other sects of Protestant Christianity. And of course these numbers represent number of congregations, not individual people, but individual churches that are growing during this time period. One other aspect that's going to characterize the Second Great Awakening and differentiate it from the first is we see a deliberate focus on the African American community, particularly slave populations in the South. For the first time, we see a very deliberate effort to bring Christianity into the black community during this Second Great Awakening, both in the North and in the South. This is particularly common among the Baptists and Methodists. We see a more deliberate effort among those two groups to bring this evangelical message of revival into the black community. We see a lot of African Americans attending these large revivals. We see even some slaves are attending these revivals, and this is partly due to this message of salvation being available to everyone. Whether you're free or slave, it doesn't matter, white or black, salvation is available to you through these revival ministries. So this, we don't see any real emphasis on racial equality here, or social equality, but spiritual equality. And this is kind of one of the messages that's coming across in these revival ministries, is that in the eyes of God, everyone is equal. Here on earth, of course, we've got white and black divided, men and women divided, rich and poor divided. But in the eyes of God, everyone is equal. So this message that salvation is available to all, this idea of spiritual equality, has wide appeal, especially in the black community, where in every way imaginable they are treated as subordinates or inferiors in society, but here is an opportunity for them to feel like they are more equal with other members of society. In fact, we see a lot of some of these early Baptist and Methodist preachers challenging the institution of slavery. We talked about Theodore Dwight Weld and his openly overt message of anti-slavery. What we'll see, though, is that as this message starts to spread, preaching to the black community, it's going to differentiate between North and South. In the North, we'll see congregations being more inclusive of white and black, and this message being a little bit more equally delivered. In the South, it's not going to happen exactly the same way. We'll see the ministries that are taking place in the South. The message of this anti-slavery message is conspicuously absent from those Southern ministries. In fact, they're going to go in the opposite direction. As the abolitionist movement, we'll talk about this here in a little bit, as the abolitionist movement grows and we start to see this emphasis that that slavery is a sin and that's why it should be abolished, and this message, this anti-slavery message, being incorporated into these revival ministries. In the South, we see just the opposite. We see Southern ministers making an effort to preach to the black community, but the message is somewhat different. They tend to they're using Christianity, encouraging slaves and free blacks both to convert to Christianity, and they're using it to try and reinforce the institution of slavery. And this is kind of we see an example of this here. A black minister preaching to a congregation here made up of a plantation owner and his family and all the slaves on this plantation, all sitting here in the same little chapel listening to the same message. And part of this message, of this revival message, is going to include an emphasis on passages from the Bible that appear to rationalize slavery. And we'll see this being incorporated very deliberately into these Southern ministries. One scripture in particular, if you're interested in looking this up, it's in the Old Testament. Ephesians chapter 6 verse 5 states that slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. So here we see in the South, revival ministers are taking this, they're using this as an opportunity to try and reinforce or shore up the institution of slavery. And this is coming as kind of a direct response to the Northern abolitionist attitude toward slavery as a sin and it should be abolished. So it's kind of ironic that they're using this newfound Christian faith among the black community as a way to try and reinforce their status as slaves. And this image that we're looking at here, this illustration, is from a London newspaper in the 1830s. And this article was kind of expressing surprise and confusion over this image because from the English or the European perspective, things like this were difficult to imagine because the abolitionist movement had already taken hold in Europe. In fact, it began in England. Slavery, the slave trade was abolished in the British Empire in 1807, and the institution of slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833. So in the 1830s, when we see this revival ministry really taking hold and these messages using the Bible to reinforce the institution of slavery, from the British perspective, this is kind of confusing. So when this article ran in a London newspaper, they're kind of scratching their heads. They're going, what's going on in America? We have abolished slavery here in the British Empire, yet in America, this land of the free, they still seem to be clinging to it. And not only that, they seem to be using Christian religion as a way to reinforce this institution of slavery. But so this was this whole situation was kind of an anomaly in the Atlantic world, which was moving away from slavery. In America, there was the appearance of using Christian religion to actually reinforce slavery in the South. So just some interesting aspects of this Second Great Awakening that we see a lot of different things going on here. And of course, we already mentioned that the Second Great Awakening is going to give rise to various social reform movements. Abolitionists and women's rights. We'll talk about women's rights later on in the next session. But for now, we're going to focus on the abolitionist movement. And we talked about how this takes place. Religious revival very often leads to social reform. In fact, throughout the 1800s, this 19th century age of reform, we see this as kind of a pattern. As society moves forward in technology and business and government, very often we see a kind of a growing gap between social values and traditional spiritual values. So very often is the case every time in history, or oftentimes in history, when we see periods of rapid growth or social development, we see it followed very closely by periods of religious revival. At our first Great Awakening, remember, it came on the coattails of the Enlightenment. A period of significant social change, social and political change that was taking place during that era. And that first Great Awakening was an attempt to try and remind people of their faith. And it just looked like society was moving away from its traditional values. Here in the early 1800s, we see a similar pattern. The Industrial Revolution, economic and political and technological changes taking place. Society is moving forward very rapidly, and it appears as though society's forgetting its spiritual roots, and this religious revival is an attempt to try and get society to reconnect with its core values. So very often what happens is that social reform will grow out of these periods of religious revival. And that's what's happening here in this case of the abolitionist movement. We talked about Theodore Dwight Weld, a revivalist minister who had a very anti-slavery message woven into his sermon. So people like him, and there were many others, they will help. They're not only spreading religious revival, they are spreading this message of anti-slavery. And that's how the abolitionist movement is going to grow. In a lot of these communities where we see a renewed interest in spirituality and religion, we see these same communities starting to become active in the pursuit of abolishing slavery. So we see a connection, of course, especially with Christianity now being focused, directed toward the black community. We see more and more interest in eliminating slavery. What will happen? It's important to note here that as this abolitionist movement begins to coalesce and grow and gain momentum, we need to differentiate terms here. Abolitionism is not the same thing as anti-slavery. Up until this point in our story, we've seen numerous occasions where various groups of people will oppose slavery for different reasons. We talked about during the Constitutional Convention, the issue of slavery comes up, but it's a political issue. We talked about the representation of states in Congress. During the Missouri crisis, we talked about the expansion of slavery onto the frontier. Slavery was still very much a political issue. Again, referring to this balance of power between free states and slave states. So a lot of the people were opposed to slavery for political reasons. We see in the North, a lot of businesses who have to pay for laborers in their factories, they tend to oppose slavery for economic reasons. The South doesn't have to pay for labor, so they have an unfair economic advantage over the North. If Southern planters had to pay their farm workers instead of having them as slaves, then they wouldn't be so disproportionately rich than some of the northern businessmen. So again, we see an economic and a political argument against slavery. So it is possible for a person to be anti-slavery without actually being an abolitionist. What defines the abolitionists is their desire to bring about the immediate and unconditional end of slavery as an institution. So we see it looks like semantics, but there's actually a difference here. It's kind of like the square and the rectangle. If you remember your high school geometry, a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not necessarily a square. All abolitionists were opposed to slavery, but not everyone who was opposed to slavery was an abolitionist. A lot of people were opposed to slavery, but they were not committed to bringing about an end to the institution. So there is some difference here, and we see too when we start talking about the how this issue becomes a political issue in terms of the a strong political support for the abolitionist movement. We'll see a lot of politicians kind of differentiating themselves here. Some will be opposed to slavery for political reasons, but they don't take an active stand against it in terms of the abolitionist movement. One of the most outspoken and prominent abolitionists is a guy named William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison, he becomes, I guess, one of the most important and influential abolitionists because he's kind of a lightning rod. He draws a lot of attention. He's got resources. He organizes big movements. He travels around with this message. So he's a big organizer, and he's going to gain a lot of publicity for the abolitionist movement because of his activities. Garrison, like many others in the abolitionist movement, his main goal is to bring about the immediate and unconditional end of slavery. Slavery is a sin. It should not exist, and we must end it now, immediately, unconditionally, and with no compensation to the slave owners. A lot of people who advocated an end of slavery, they were conflicted because of Fifth Amendment issues. They're hesitant to pass a law abolishing slavery because technically they'd be eliminating private property without due process of law. And so a lot of people want to put conditions on this abolitionist movement. They say, okay, if we're going to get rid of slaves, then we need to compensate the slave owners. Garrison disagrees here. Garrison says unconditional, no exceptions, slavery must end, no compensation to the slave owners. It's a sin, and we shouldn't pay them for it. Garrison will form an abolitionist newspaper, a publication called The Liberator. It's devoted exclusively to abolitionist issues and spreading this message of the abolitionist movement to a wider audience. And newspapers like The Liberator, and there will be numerous others. In fact, Garrison's newspaper wasn't the first. It was just one of the most widely circulated. Printed in Boston and circulated throughout the North. And of course, we'll see a lot of attempts to try and circulate these newspapers in the South too, to try and generate support from a wider audience with varying degrees of success. But these newspapers are important because they help spread this message. They help generate awareness among the public. A lot of people, especially in the far northern states, where slavery had never been important from the very beginning, and it was abolished very early on. Like I say, a lot of states had gotten rid of slavery in the late 1790s, early 1800s. By the time we get to 1810, 1815, slavery doesn't really exist in the North at all. So if you're from one of those far northern states, you might not even really be aware that this abolitionist movement is an issue. Slavery hasn't existed in your state for many years. You've never come in contact with a slave or a slave owner, so there's not a lot of awareness of the issue in some places. So these newspapers are important in generating interest in and generating awareness of these issues. For people who might not otherwise get involved, these newspapers kind of bring them into this network of the abolitionist cause. He forms one of the first abolitionist societies called the American Anti-Slavery Society, and there were a lot of these too. This is just one of the most prominent ones, but for a long time, a lot of these abolitionist movements were independent of each other. There wasn't a lot of coordination among these groups. Every state had its own separate little abolitionist society. Sometimes there'd be one in every city in some places. So there's a lot of autonomy among these anti-slavery societies. Not a lot of coordination among them, and these newspapers kind of help to coordinate the activities of these various societies, get everybody on the same sheet of music, working toward a common cause in a cooperative effort. And of course, and in many of these same ways, Garrison is very similar to other abolitionists. There were dozens of men just like Garrison who had the same message, and of course, there were dozens of newspapers and anti-slave societies. But Garrison will be distinguished for one important characteristic, and that is the fact that he advocates for racial equality in addition to the end of slavery. According to Garrison, and a very small group, a small minority of abolitionists had this message. They say we should end slavery immediately and unconditionally, and we should also seek racial equality, equal rights for both black and white citizens in America. Now, while today this is it seems perfectly reasonable. No one has a real big issue with this. This seems like a natural extension of the anti-slavery movement. But in the 1830s, the idea of racial equality was not popular. Even among people who believed that slavery was a sin, very few of them advocated for racial equality. And we see this even in the North, especially in the industrial cities where there's a lot of factory jobs. A lot of factory workers fell into this category of, okay, they opposed slavery, but they didn't believe in racial equality because they didn't want to compete. They didn't want the blacks to compete with the whites for jobs in a place where jobs might be few and far between, or a limited number of jobs available. If whites and blacks had to compete equally for those jobs, there'd be a lot more people in line for each job. If certain jobs were exclusive to only white employees, then it gave some of these factory workers an advantage over the black community. So a lot of people opposed racial equality. It was not a popular idea. So Garrison here is one of a very small group of people who are advocating for racial equality in the 1830s. And this idea will never really enjoy any widespread popularity until on into the next century, into the 20th century. Small groups periodically will advocate for racial equality. And there's a brief period in the years right after the Civil War where a movement to create racial equality for both whites and blacks, but they won't accomplish much, and it'll kind of fizzle out. We won't see true racial equality being achieved, or true gains being achieved in the area of racial equality until the mid 20th century. So this idea is in its infancy here in the 1830s, and there's not a lot of support for it. And for this reason, a lot of people are going to quit Garrison's anti-slave society and form their own. In fact, what happens is that because of his views on racial equality, a lot of people who had followed Garrison for a lot of years, they will kind of break away from him and distance themselves from him because they don't share his views on racial equality. And what's interesting to note here too is that a lot of the people who are opposed to racial equality, they weren't necessarily opposed to it because they had any racial hatred of the black community. A lot of people were opposed to it because they didn't believe it was a practical goal. When they're looking at the abolitionist movement in terms of what can be achieved in the 1830s, a lot of people thought that the end of slavery that's doable. We could probably work toward this goal with a reasonable chance of success. To achieve racial equality, that's going to be a lot harder to do in the 1830s. So a lot of people were opposed to racial equality because they didn't believe that it was a practical goal, and that if you were advocating racial equality, you might alienate some other people who might otherwise join the abolitionist movement. So the end of slavery was seen as a more practical or realistic goal than racial equality. So there's a lot of issues here, a lot of factors that will make this an unpopular idea in the 1830s. Take a look at some illustrations here. Here's a photograph of William Lloyd Garrison. Uh, Again, this is later in life. He actually got his start in the abolitionist movement at age 25. So as a young man, he began his crusade to end slavery. This, of course, this photograph was taken later on in his life. Uh, a brief footnote here, trivia on photographs. Photography, the science and art of photography emerged as one of the new technologies during the Industrial Revolution. In the 1830s, a French designer, engineer, scientist, a guy named Daguerre, came up with this process for transferring images onto glass plates treated with various chemicals. This became kind of the standard for photography in the 1830s. By 1840, we see the first photography studio opening in the United States in New York City, and by the late 1840s, in most of the major cities in the United States, and of course in Europe as well, there are photography studios where you can go and have your portrait made, or they can set up remote photography sites to take pictures of important events and so forth. So we see, starting in the 1830s, early 1840s, we see photographic records of significant events showing up in history and newspapers and so forth. So from now on in our class, we'll start looking at more and more photographs of some of these important people and events. Just kind of a trivial footnote here in terms of some of the technologies that are being developed during the Industrial Revolution. Here, of course, is a headline of Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. Again, you can see here in the subtitle on his front page, "Our country is the world, our countrymen are mankind." And here again, this is kind of hinting at his belief in racial equality. All men created equal. He's taken this right out of the Declaration of Independence. All men are equal, white and black. Again, this is a kind of a radical notion in the 1830s. Not a lot of people support this. Of course, his publication is in Boston, where his society originated, the American Anti-Slave Society that he founded, also based in Boston, which is, of course, his hometown. So that's all we're going to do for today. When we come back in the next session, we're gonna continue our discussion of the abolitionist movement in terms of the propaganda campaign to spread this message of abolitionist cause far and wide, to include into the South, and we'll talk a little bit about the Southern response to this abolitionist movement. So until then, take care.